Testing, testing, test, test, test. Nothing there? Test, test, no?
We will get started in 2 minutes, so if you need to use the bathroom, get a drink, do so now.
Test, test, test. Test, 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 test. Test, 1, 2, 3. Test, 1, 2, 3. Test, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. The April 30th School Financing Review Commission meeting will come to order. We welcome everyone here to the April 30th, 2026 School Financing Review Commission meeting. You've probably noticed that I am running the meeting today as Vice Chair. Dr. Maher is unable to join us. He's not feeling well right now. But we are going to run the agenda as it was planned, and we're going to begin by having the recording secretary call roll.
Paul Turman.
Here.
Tom Breezy.
Here.
Jason Dolliver.
Here.
Grant Latimer.
Here.
Keith Runge.
Here.
Shauna Koger.
Here.
Brian Maher. Aaron Ploss.
Here.
Liz Standish.
Here.
Ann Foster. Luann Linehan.
Here.
Sarah Scott.
Here.
Shavonna Holman.
Here.
John Schwartz.
Here.
Senator Elliott Bostar. Senator Jana Hughes.
Here.
Senator Dave Merman.
Here.
12 voting members present.
With 12 members present, we have a quorum established. Please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted as you enter the room at the main entrance doors. The minutes from the previous meeting were provided in advance to committee members. A copy is also provided for each commission member at your table. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion for this agenda item?
So moved.
Second. Okay. It's moved and seconded to approve the minutes from the previous School Financing Review Commission meeting. Would the recording secretary please call roll?
Shavonna Holman.
Yes.
Brian Maher. Aaron Ploss.
Yes.
Tom Breezy. John Schwartz.
Yes.
Ann Foster. Liz Standish.
Yes.
Grant Latimer.
Yes.
Keith Runge.
Yes.
Sarah Scott.
Yes.
Luann Linehan.
Yes.
Shauna Koger.
Yes.
Jason Dolliver.
Yes.
Paul Turman.
Yes.
12 yes.
Okay, there are 12 yes votes. The affirmative has it, and the motion to approve the minutes of the previous School Financing Review Commission meeting is adopted. All right. The agenda for everyone here today, there's really two big items that we'll be tackling together today. The first is there is two committees that have been working over this past quarter in order to tackle various areas of responsibility. The first committee, which has included Dr. Ploss will be pinch hitting for Ann Foster, who is absent today, but she was the facilitator of that committee, deals with the needs and resources. So Aaron will provide a presentation, and we'll be able to then interact on the information by that first Needs and Resources Committee. And then after that committee concludes, the second committee, which focused more on school spending, will provide a presentation. We'll have a discussion. And then finally, the second item is we'll have Bryce Wilson come share review some recent legislation and potential implication for us to discuss as a commission as well. Dr. Ploss, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by reiterating that I'm pinch hitting today, and so anything I do wrong, sorry. Doing the best I can. Oh, I'm up there. Awesome. Great. Okay, so as Dr. Schwartz talked about, I was going to provide a report on behalf of our committee. Our committee is analyzing the needs and resources side of the formula with committee members of Ann Foster, Dr. Shavonna Holman, Senator Jana Hughes, former Senator Luann Linehan, myself, Sarah Scott, and Dr. Liz Standish. We had the opportunity to meet several times throughout the course of the last few months, a lot of virtual and in-person meetings, each of them lasting 3 to 4 hours. So we put in about 20 hours of work within our committee, and that is well short of the amount of time that our staff at NDE that was helping us put in with Bryce and Tyler. I've probably got to begin by thanking them for their time and effort. The amount of hours they put in to get us data from other states and, within our own formula was just immense. And so we can't say thank you enough to those two. Kind of a reminder of the goals of our committee or our subcommittee. The first one is just to evaluate the needs aspect of the formula, including factors such as poverty, English learners, early childhood, college going, workforce development, literacy and graduation rates. And this is where we have spent a lot of our time so far. We really tried to narrow in at the beginning on the needs side. We have worked through a lot of the different portions of the formula, but we really have focused on the needs side with a little bit of resources so far. Second task, again, up there is the resources side and all that goes into it, both from the state, local, and federal level. Our first meeting, if you guys remember, as a commission, we had Bryce Wilson and his team come up and just kind of talk about the different components of the formula. Each of those is represented on the screen in a box, and you can see there are several boxes. And so when we started talking about focusing on the needs side, there are 18 components to the needs side of the formula. It is a pretty complex portion of it, and so it is not going to be super quick work. It's not something that we're going to be able to do overnight. We found that out as we were working our way through it. So the first thing that we wanted to do was have them come back, and Bryce went through it. Bryce and Tyler went through the needs side and kind of how each component interacted with each other, just to give us a little bit more of a deep dive. As we were getting through there, we kind of realized the first thing that we should probably focus our time and energy on is the poverty allowance. The reason being is it's a big part of the component of the formula. It's really important right now as it's been something that we found some areas within the structure that we felt like needed to be reviewed. And so we wanted to evaluate alternative measures and ultimately come to a recommendation to this committee. And so you are going to see a ton of information on the poverty allowance because it is such a big portion of this presentation and has been a majority of our work. Instead of me going through what currently we do within the poverty allowance, because it is so complex, we felt like it made the most sense for somebody from NDE to come up, and Tyler is going to provide us information on the next 6 or 7 slides, just so we can have that baseline understanding of what does the poverty allowance and how does it function within our formula. And so we'll have Tyler come up and do that. Oh, I lied. Bryce is here. Sorry. Didn't know you were going to make it on time. My fault.
All right. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess. Aaron asked me to cover what the current poverty allowance is, and so we're going to go through. You have the clicker here, right? Okay. No, you're good. So the current poverty allowance, I think it's important to understand, one of the big things with it is it doesn't generate state aid directly. It is an allowance. It generates formula need and directs it specifically to a district that's incurring or has a higher percentage of poverty students in their district. And so when we look at the poverty allowance, it is an allowance that means it subtracts from basic funding. It also has a weighted structure. So as you go up 5%, from 0 to 5%, 5 to 10%, all the way up to 30%, the weighting of formula need that you get for those students increases from each of those different ranges. So go ahead. Another component of poverty allowance that's really important for people to understand is that we have 2 different indicators that we look at to determine poverty percentage in a district. We look at low-income students. That's information that we obtain from the IRS, and it is for what's reported as children under 19 in households that are at or below the free meal income threshold for the size of their family. We adjust that ratio by the number of formula students to total children in that district. So we have a census count that we have that has all the children in that district, whether they go to the public school or not. And we take essentially formula students as a way to determine the number of students in that district to weight and come up with the low-income student for that district that would be attending, or an approximation of that. And then the other one is free lunch counts. By far the most commonly or the most used indicator in the poverty allowance. And those are counts as of November 1st for the year prior to the year that it's actually 2 years prior to the year we're calculating. So when we certified the 26-27 TIOSA aid, it was the November 2024 counts that were used, free lunch counts. And then that's where if a district has elected to be a CEP district, community eligibility provision, speaking in acronyms, Then we have to take the identified student percentage times the number of students in that district and adjust it to come up with an approximate free lunch count for those schools or districts. So when we're calculating the poverty allowance, we're going to compare, then statute tells us to compare the greater, or actually to use the greater of the low income counts or the free lunch counts. So whichever one of those is greater is the one that's used for that district. And then we compare that to a 3-year average of poverty students. If the current year's poverty student count is larger than the 3-year average, that difference between the current year and the 3-year average is added to their count for the current year. Essentially, that's a piece to the formula that's added so that it takes into consideration the lagging time frame that the poverty student counts are. It also gives a district a bump that has a big increase in poverty students, understanding that there are kind of startup costs when you have a big increase in poverty in your district. So then we have to determine what is that district's poverty percentage to their total student percentage. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, they have a weighted formula where we go from 0 to 5, 5 to 10, all the way up to the 25 to 30% bracket. When we're calculating poverty allowance, it's important, I think, to understand that we're filling up each of those buckets starting at the tier 0, tier 1, it's on this slide. So if a district is at 40% poverty, they're going to have the first 5% of their poverty at 0%, the next 5% at the 3.75% you see as the multiplier there in the tier 1 group, and that goes all the way on. Once they're over 30%, every student that they have, they continue to get funding for those students over 30%. They're just all funded at using that 22.5% multiplier from the tier 6. So that's kind of how the weighting structure works. It's not, again, that a district doesn't receive poverty funding for students that exceed the 30, once they hit the 30%, they continue to. It's just the multiplier is locked in at 22.5% after we go above 30%. So the last piece of the calculation, we go through, do that calculation according to statute, and then we have to compare to what a district submits. So their statute requires that every district submit a poverty allowance amount, and they get the lesser of what they submit or what we calculate. So because there is a correction, I guess that's tied to the poverty allowance, where if a district is, since a district's required to spend 117.65% of the amount they get, which sounds like a weird number, but when worked backwards, that's 85% of the poverty allowance amount that they got. And the reason for that is all the allowances were designed to reimburse a district 85%. Essentially, local districts were, the thought when TIOSA was designed was that local districts would be on hook for 15%, the state would come in and reimburse 85%. So that's the 117.65% requirement. Since there's that correction, they give districts the opportunity to request a lower amount than what we calculate, or a lot of districts don't submit anything, likely because they're non-equalized, and so since it's not a direct aid, they don't get any funding for it. So that's kind of how the mechanics of it works. This slide here is just kind of focusing on those tiers. So again, giving you a little bit more information. So what does that 0 to 5% tier look like? What do they get for the first 5% of poverty in the district? Well, it's 0. It's at the bottom of that slide. And if you look at that tier 0, as you go up, you can see the dollar amounts that are associated with every student that's in that specific bucket. So tier 1's $554.79 per kid, all the way up to tier 6, which tops out at $3,328.71 per kid in poverty allowance. Again, it's not funding, it's need, which can result in funding depending on the district's overall TIOSA situation. So, but again, buckets, I think that just the important thing to understand here is there are buckets, and each of those buckets has to be filled. And so if a district has a poverty percentage of 18%, their top students that are in that top bucket are going to be at that tier 3 level. So just kind of an example there, they would max out at the $1,664 per kid, with the other kids underneath the 15% threshold falling in those other buckets. Okay.
You can quickly see why we wanted Bryce to do that and not me. Like it's a pretty complex and pretty large process within our within that one allowance. And so, as a committee, we went back. We decided, okay, we now know all of that information that you guys got a highlight of. What are our goals after receiving that? And here's what we've kind of come up with is, number one, as a committee, we decided we felt like the poverty allowance is a really important part of the formula. Almost every state in the union accounts for the additional funds that are necessary to educate a student in poverty. We know that there's additional intervention work that needs to be done by schools, and we felt like it was an important part of the needs side of the component. And so we wanted to make sure that we continued to honor that work as well. Second, third and fourth one kind of all run together. We really wanted to look at a way to simplify the formula. Bryce just went through that, I believe, in 9 steps. Each one had different layers within it as well. And so are there ways to simplify the formula, improve the functionality within it, and also by doing those two things, increase the transparency of it? And so those were all goals of ours as we continued to look through this allowance. And then the last one is, are there parts of the formula that made sense when they were put in, whether that was in 1990, whether that was in the reversion in 2008, whether that was over the last 3 years, as that has been built out and as an allowance, are there parts of it that are antiquated that we could remove completely? And so those were kind of our goals within the poverty allowance. And so here's what we began analyzing for change. There is the 3-year poverty averaging adjustment, the smoothing mechanism that Bryce talked about. What happened if we removed that? What about the district provided maximum? So there is the allowance that is when you fall into one of those buckets. What does the state determine that you would need for poverty? And then the district could submit their poverty allowance as well. And so what happens if we remove the district provided maximum? What happened if we looked at direct certification counts instead of the lagging indicators that we currently have now with a little more real time? And then the buckets, we had the 6 tiers of the buckets in there. What happens if we looked and reviewed those tiers and try to find a way to simplify it? And so those are where we began. We're going to dive a little deeper on each of them. The first one is just the poverty averaging adjustment. And so this was included to account for the increasing poverty rates and the lagging indicator of the data. And so I believe Bryce said the 26-27 model was running off at 2024 data. And so you can see that there's a huge gap between those years. And so there's not much that's in real time. And so it was put in place to try to help that process. This has led to some weird data anomalies, including when schools have high poverty rates, but they have decreasing populations. There are times that the formula pumped out that they had more than 100% of students in poverty, which obviously we know isn't possible. But that was just how it was playing out. And then kind of tying, you're going to see each one of these ties to each other, but if we did look at utilizing direct certification, that puts things in a little more real time, and so it would make this 3-year averaging adjustment a little less relevant. And so those were things that tied together. The next one is the district provided maximum. So currently, as Bryce said, you could go fall into all the tiers and it'll say that, your district has a poverty allowance of $100,000. We're not certain we're going to spend 117.5%, or we don't want to code it, or it's not going to provide our district any additional funds. And so we're going to submit 0, or we're going to submit less than the $100,000 that we feel like we need, just to make it easier on the district, because it's not going to actually produce any funds on the back end. And we're seeing that quite a bit within the formula as well. And so is there really a need for that any longer? One thing that has come out of that as we were looking into it is it's led to an undercounting of poverty needs within the state. If a school is not using the maximum, or they aren't submitting up to what the maximum is, and we're utilizing that to show what our poverty allowance is, obviously it's leading to an undercounting. When that takes place, it does impact the basic funding within schools as well. And so it was having kind of a second-tier consequence as well. The third part is that direct certification. So with that lagging data, it has led to some weird responsiveness and a misaligning of funds over the course of the years. And so direct certification was something that we looked into to see if that was a better data point to use to analyze poverty. It has its pros and it has its cons that we're going to go over as well, but just kind of a quick overview of what direct certification is. That would be students that qualify for the federal assistance within a program, and so it could be SNAP, it could be CHIP, or others. There's 7 of them. We are able, as a DHHS, is able to provide what students within our school system qualify for those, and so it is in real time, and in that moment what your rates would be utilizing those students. And so as we began to look at that, we also realized that transitioning to direct certification, it does improve that precision, the accuracy, the in the moment. We're not looking 3 years backwards. It's still not perfect though, because there is a gap. Currently, if not all of our students that are on free and reduced lunch are in a direct certification program. And so you might have a school system where you have 30% free and reduced students, but maybe 20% are on direct certification. And so that gap is something that we've been trying to analyze. How do we account for that? Because not every student's going to qualify. And so one thing that when we began looking at direct certification, we realized it is the primary source utilized by most states around us. We were constantly looking at other states and how they do it, and most all states are moving towards or have moved to direct certification, so it'd be a little more in line with that, as are other areas within our state as well. So digging into that one, because it would be a fairly significant change, we wanted to just identify what the strengths of moving to direct certification are and what the weaknesses would be. So strengths, it improves the accuracy of the data because it's in the real time, and we know that every student that's in a direct certification also needs additional support within the school systems. It aligns with the fall membership counts, and so since you can take that out in real time, November 1 is when all of our fall membership information becomes official with the state of Nebraska or with NDE, and so it would align with that as we could pull those numbers directly at that date as well. It would massively simplify the poverty calculation because it removes all the adjustments. It removes the integration of multiple data points because you're not just submitting your free and reduce. You also have the direct certification currently, and so it would just remove one of those and make it pretty easy. And also it just adds transparency. We'd be able to easily tell people, why is your poverty rate 20%? Our number of students on direct certification at that time was 20%. It's very simple and easy and transparent. So those were the strengths of doing it. It does come with its set of challenges as well. The first one is the one we talked about earlier. It'll underestimate the poverty needs without some careful consideration. If we're currently saying that school is at 30% free and reduced, and overnight it goes to 20% free and reduced, that's a weird messaging, and we've got to account for that somehow. You might be asking, why would it be 20% direct certification but 30% free and reduced? We do have students that qualify for free and reduced, but they're not within a federal program, so they're not on SNAP or CHIP or Medicaid or any of those, and so that accounts for some of it. We also would have some undocumented students that wouldn't fall into the direct certification either, and so that accounts for the gap in there. If we move to direct certification, that data accuracy issues with the transfer of students, and so as an example, right now you have 30 students that are on free and reduced out of the 100. We do have some transferring of students, so they might be calculated in one system and not the other just based on the timing. And so we currently have that as an issue, and it would continue to be an issue, but every student would be worth more if the percentage is lower. And so that does create a little bit of a something to work through. It does have potential for volatility based on changes to direct certification. So we have 7 direct certification programs. If the mechanism to qualify for CHIP changes, that would change the number of students that we have that qualify for poverty within our schools as well, and so we're a little more subject to those federal changes. And then how that distribution shifts compares to the current counts. Obviously, if you go from 30% to 20% overnight, we're going to figure out how that smoothing mechanism works for all the schools that this impacts. So that's where we spent a lot of our work to date. And you can see as you dive in, we tried to put that into a few slides, but there are a lot of different components that touch each other. And so we now kind of outline what our next steps of poverty allowance. And we want to just put this out there. We believe this might be the most complex of all of the needs side of the formula. So if you go back to the box that we showed you and it has 18 components to the needs, we believe the poverty allowance might be the most complex. And so we're spending quite a bit of time on it because we think it's really important, and it's just a really, really complex box. And so we're hoping that we can get to some final recommendations, but we need really 4 things to take place that we're looking at. The first is finalize the new weighted tier structure. We currently have those 6 tiers. Every 5% is when additional funding came in. We found that was quite a bit more tiers than a lot of states have. They weren't going every 5%, they're going 10, 15, 20, 25%. And so we want to re-look at what our tier structure works, hopefully reducing it down, just making it simplifying it through there. The next was to determine the best practice to capture our free lunch students that are not in direct certification, that gap between. We did a lot of Bryce and Tyler did a ton of work to try to look at different ways for us to capture those students or continue to smooth that out. You would think maybe it's as easy as just finding a multiplier. We just say, oh, all schools are 30% more than what their direct certification. As they dug in, that was not the case. And so within our last committee meeting alone, I believe they brought 8 different options for us to analyze and review. And they're doing an awesome job, but we need to continue to look at that to figure out what how that translates the best. Kind of what our next plan on that is to do, as we come up with a potential recommendation, we're going to do a 10-year look back. If this were in place for the last 10 years, what would have happened within the formula? If it's a slow and steady increase of 1 to 3%, it's probably working. If we see big, huge swings between it, that might not be the right recipe. And so they're going to pull that data, and we're going to continue to figure out how to capture those free lunch students that are not in direct certification. The third bullet there is just ensure the balance between current funding and actual needs. We have probably some undercounting of actual needs at this moment. And so we know where schools are funded, we know how much is being utilized within the formula for poverty. How do we connect that to the actual needs and make sure that we'll allow some sort of smoothing effect on the back end? And then probably the most important, we go through all these and we have ideas and we think we know what the best route is, but we really need those modeled. And so once we center on a recommendation, we want to have a model of all school districts in the state of Nebraska. Right now, we spend our time on, if we make this change, what happens to the state funding? And we can find out it goes up at 1%, down at 1%, whatever that is. But how's it actually impacting individual districts? When we start to get towards those recommendations, we want to have those modeled out by NDE, and so we can see if there's nuances within there that it's not doing as intended. And so those are kind of our next steps and what we're going to focus on as a committee here in the short term. So that was a lot to get to we don't have a finalized recommendation. But we did have one recommendation that we came out of here. We had some discussions within our committee, the whole group committee, about needs stabilization. A reminder, needs stabilization is kind of the end of the need. And so when it gets to the end, any district, they keep their need at 100% of the prior year. And so if you're a $10 million needs as a district, and the following year it calculates out at 9.8 million, the needs stabilization would add 200,000 to get you back to 10 million. And there were questions within the committee: is that necessary? Does that, is a district going to stay in needs stabilization for the rest of their existence because maybe their students are reducing? And so we did a deep dive into that, and we looked at the usage over time. The first thing that we wanted to note that really stood out to our committee is generally this accounts for 0.04 to 0.5% of total needs within the state. And so when we realized that particular box of the needs side of the formula, it doesn't equate to many dollars. It doesn't equate to very much on the front end. But we still dug in and looked into it. To the question is, are districts going to stay in need stabilization for the rest of their existence? To date, no, that doesn't take place. Most schools aren't equalized. So For the state funding, you'd have to be equalized to actually have that money come into your district. Most schools that are equalized don't fall into needs stabilization. Unequalized schools have fell into it. The longest one has been in through kind of a statistical anomaly was 7 years. Generally, if a school falls into it, it doesn't last very long and they're out of it. And so it's not equating to many dollars for the state of Nebraska. Or districts, but when it was utilized, our committee felt like it was a really important mechanism. It allowed for local districts to not have huge swings that impacted their taxpayers, and so if they had something take place in their local community that really impacted their state aid from one year to the next, this allowed a smoothing mechanism. And if it wasn't there in the few times that it was being utilized, it would have had a dramatic impact on property taxes and local funding for those individual districts. And so as we looked at it, it's decreasing in significance and use over time. It's such a small portion of it. We felt like when it was being utilized, it was as intended. And so we are going to make the recommendation to keep the needs stabilization functioning as it is currently, since it is, in our opinion, working. So next steps for us as a committee, beyond we're going to finalize and hopefully come with a recommendation of the poverty allowance, and we kind of had a slide outlining what we need to do to get to that point. And so hopefully we'll come back to you with a recommendation here soon. The second thing that we need to do is this poverty allowance has taken a lot of time because it is so complex, and we know that we need to address some of the other portions of the needs side a little bit quicker. And so our next one is to look at the potential removal of 3 areas within the needs side. That's to try to simplify it, and that's the distance education allowance, the elementary site allowance, and the poverty allowance correction. If we have a recommendation there, we might not need the correction. So that would be eliminating 3 of those components. Each of those, again, we're working our way through. We want to model them. We want to make sure that they're functioning as intended, but we're going to discuss the removal of those areas. And then finally, we want to really hone in on the next area of allowances, which includes the limited English proficiency, the transportation, and the summer school. And so we want to do a deep dive on each of those 3 allowances, hopefully come back to our next meeting. This is kind of our to-do list that we're going to try to hold ourselves accountable to. With that, be happy to answer any questions, and if they're about the current formula and how it operates in poverty, I'm going to call Bryce back up. But in the meantime, happy to answer any questions.
Could you back up two to three slides to that needs stabilization slide right there? 0.5%, that's a misprint. 0.04 to point.
Yes, half of 1%, so 0.04%.
Okay.
And if you're talking basis points, it'd be 4 basis points to 50 basis points. So half of 1% is the max.
Half of 1% can be significant. So overall, what does it amount to on average statewide?
It was I believe 2 million out of 5 billion.
2 million, okay.
2 million out of 5 billion, yep.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Senator Merman? Yes, and please make sure you unmute.
There we go. Okay, I've got to apologize. I think I'm supposed to be on this committee, but, so I missed 20 hours or so of discussion, very disappointed. That's kind of a joke. But it probably took place, I suppose, while we were in session, so probably missed it for that reason. But I don't know if I missed an email or what, but I wasn't even aware.
Yeah, if that's the case, we can absolutely get that corrected.
You weren't on the other one, though?
I think I'm on,
You weren't on the one with,
I think I'm supposed to be on this one.
okay.
We had Senator Bostar.
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah.
I don't know how I missed it, but, and also I do have some handouts that have to do with needs and resources. It's more of a macro view. I did talk to Dr. Maher about passing them out. I don't know if this is a place to pass them out, or I can do it at some other point during the meeting.
Is it related to this particular
Yes.
committee's work?
Related to needs and resources.
I think that's fine. Let's finish the conversation around Dr. Plaza's presentation first, and then we can transition to that topic.
Okay, and
Senator
I'd like
Merman.
to discuss it a little bit after I hand them out. Thanks.
Any questions on the work of the committee so far? Any additional questions, I should say?
I have a couple of questions, and maybe Bryce, some of these might fit with him too, but when you look at those respective tiers, I mean, are there school districts that fall into the tier one? I mean, so is it spread evenly across those various tiers?
No, that's something that we did look at, is the number of schools that fall within each of those tiers. And I can't remember if there's any that fall in the first tier or not. There are that are under 5. Every tier. Okay, every tier has schools that are within there, but there does start to become a point in there where a majority of the schools fall into a couple tiers. And so it's your standard bell curve in some ways.
And it's harder to do with, I mean, when you had the 19 up there, but when you get to the very last slide where you say these are the other kind of need areas, is there an opportunity to try to explore? I mean, there seems to be some level of kind of multi-linearity there, that if you're high poverty, you're also going to be high transportation allowance, that these are all variables that are very much interrelated with each other. So I'm not sure if that might tease out that we've got so many factors, but in fact, putting them all more in one respective bucket and elevating that bucket may simplify the model more significantly.
I don't know that we've found a place that simplifies the model as much as when we start to dig in, we do start to figure out how they are interrelated. And so if you remove an allowance, it increases basic funding, and then that touches every school in the state of Nebraska. Or every time that we look to remove something or change something, it does touch a different area, to your point. And so that's why we're trying to make sure that we have teased out all the what ramifications come from each action. Every time you pull a lever, it changes the lever. And so that's why we want to make sure that we're going through slow and meticulously. And the end result is we still got to have models for everything that we recommend. That way we can see if there is, if that function changes for every school in the state of Nebraska or certain areas as well. So yeah, we actually just had this discussion. Like, where do we go exactly? We've got 18 needs side. I think there's 7 or 8 on the resources side. Should we finish needs and go to resources? And so something as a committee we've discussed is finding the areas that are the most impacted, or the largest portions of the needs side and the largest portions of the resources, and maybe bouncing between those high impact areas and then working our way towards some of the smaller ones.
Yeah, because I would just think there's probably a pretty good relationship to every school that's in a tier 6 also fits in the same bucket or category for one of the other need areas too, and just something to try to explore a little bit. But maybe as it relates to the conversation we've been having in the spending group too, at some point I think we probably clearly articulated why additional need is there for low poverty, because it costs the district in these respective areas. I think beginning to clearly re-articulate that this is why we have to make an adjustment for poverty, because it costs the district more the more students they have in those respective buckets. And I think it feeds into what we'll talk a little bit about on the spending side too.
Yeah, look forward to that. Any additional questions?
I will just, I'm not going to let you get off the hook.
Dang it, I thought I was leaving.
I just had a couple thoughts, and they're very positive, so you can relax. First of all, the point you made about the poverty allowance being one of the more complicated elements of the need side of the formula, I agree. In fact, Bryce, nice job explaining it. I think every time the poverty allowance is explained to me, I learned something different that I had forgotten from the prior time. You did a really nice job with that. But finding a way to streamline that component of the formula has been a need for a while. I also wanted to reinforce something that you mentioned several times that's important, is just modeling that out. Modeling it out based on different assumptions, but even that 10-year look back to see how things that we know have occurred influence how it models are just really informative steps. That means whatever recommendation comes, we know what it's going to do once it gets operationalized, or have some general sense for it. So nice job to the committee for those conversations. Those are very thoughtful.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh,
Thank you. Yeah, look, you looked at some other states, it sounds like, in addressing this. Overall, how does Nebraska's approach to poverty and education compare to other states? Or how aggressive are we relative to other states in addressing poverty in schools and adjusting the formula?
tell me if I answer this wrong, or do you want to answer it, Bryce? I'm going to give it a shot, and you tell me if I'm wrong, okay? I think what we figured out through there is every state values and understands the need to add into their formula when it comes to students of poverty, and just that additional funds can produce outcomes for students, excuse me, in that demographic. How they addressed and determined which students were in poverty was pretty erratic. I mean, everybody was kind of all over a little bit. Ours was a little more, significantly more nuanced than a lot of places. As far as actual percent of funding that went into students of poverty, I don't have any of that data, and I don't know if Bryce, if you have that or not, or in a general sense.
I guess at the end of the day, the question would be, do we spend more or less than a typical state per student in addressing poverty?
That question, I don't know that I can answer that one specifically. We looked at some of the proposals of options we were looking at lined up with kind of what averages other states are doing. A lot of states do a single or a two threshold multiplier. So essentially they just say, if you have poverty students, or you're going to get additional, I'm just making the number up, but $600. It varies by state. And if you're over 20%, you get $1,500 per kid over that threshold. So the amounts vary significantly from the states, but we really work to kind of try and find what is more average across the states, in what those dollar amounts were in some of the models that we put out there.
I think it's fair to say we spend our time on the functionality of the formula, not necessarily on the amount of spending or the amount going into it from each state. We were just more worried about the mechanisms behind it.
Okay, thank you.
Oh. I think it would be helpful for some on the others on the other that aren't in this subcommittee if Bryce could put together the slides that we used for all our discussions, because a lot of the questions, I can understand why they have the questions. They didn't see because your question, Doctor, we looked at each school and where they ended up in the buckets, and they have charts and things, and I think it would be good to share that.
I have a quick question. The number of districts for which state aid would be generated due to the poverty allowance? Does that question make sense?
Yes.
Are you asking the number of districts that are equalized that receive funding, essentially are going to get poverty funding because they're equalized?
Right.
44.
44.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I was just making sure I was understanding that right, yeah.
Which is why you see that significant undercounting. You know, 44 districts are equalized and anticipate that the poverty allowance is going to produce funding for their district. They're tight on what that looks like. And if you are a non-equalized district, you might undercount or not submit it at all because it's not going to provide any funding for your district.
Senator Murman, did you have something to share?
Yes. I like it that you can't both push the button to talk and talk over each other. I guess I question a little bit why the poverty allowance isn't done in unequalized districts. Because theoretically, you know, an unequalized district in Nebraska typically has a lot of farmland. Say 90% of the farmers in that district lost money. They don't have any ability to pay anymore, even though the determinant would show a lot of poverty in that district, and especially if it happened over a 2 or 3 year period.
That's something that we discussed quite a bit on the front end. And, you know, the current model, it accounts for districts that do not have the resources. So currently the way that it works is if you have the needs, and poverty would be a need within a district, but locally you can raise those resources, you're able to fund that locally, more locally than with state support. Those districts that are equalized, they have those needs as well, but their local resources do not have enough to fund it, and so that's where they become equalized. And so as we worked our way through that, we realized that there are students of poverty in all size districts and all funded districts. Some have the ability to take care of that locally, and some don't have that ability to take care of it locally, and that's how the model plays out. And so we focused on the model like we were supposed to.
But going back to my scenario, if 90% or all farmers in the district didn't have income that year or negative income, they don't have any more ability to pay property taxes or, you know, they would still need extra state aid.
Senator Linehan?
It's a great question, Senator Murrin. And I think one of the things our subcommittee is doing is we're not coming up to what the answer is yet on state funding. We're just coming up to what the picture is. And right now we don't have an accurate picture of all school districts. Because as they have said, some schools aren't turning in their free and reduced lunch kids or because they're not getting equalization aid, so why do the paperwork? But if we do direct cert, we'll know each district and how many kids in that district, and we'll be able to look at, I'm sure there are many schools, rural schools, that probably have a significant number of poverty kids, and we should figure that out. So that's part of what we're doing too.
Just a quick, so free and reduced numbers might not necessarily generate direct aid through TIOSA, but the free and reduced numbers do generate resources from other revenue components. So things like E-rate and grants. Just make sure we're all on the same page.
Senator Hughes?
One thing that Luann had brought up during our prior meeting was, I think going the direct cert route is the right way to go. And I believe, I'm not saying that, I don't know this for sure, but like Title I programs and stuff use direct cert information. So now we're gonna be consistent. Like, so if the feds are using direct cert for this, we should, I mean, now we're all on the same page of who the kids are that need this, and it's just consistency that way too, which I think will be helpful.
And it would not take away the ability for students to fill out free and reduced lunch applications. They just wouldn't be utilized within the formula. And so you would still have those free reduced percentages as a district in a building.
Other questions or thoughts for Dr. Plaus or the committee? Senator Murman, you had indicated you had some information to share for the committee to consider.
Yeah. Got quite a few handouts here.
Give him a hand.
I can talk about them. Be passing out 4 different maps here, and I think it'll be easier to talk about them once everybody gets the maps, but if there's something else we can discuss first, I'll talk about this a little later.
Maybe a question, Senator Murman. Is this directly related to the work of the prior committee's assignment? Or is this unrelated to the Needs and Resources Subcommittee?
Thank you.
No, I think it's totally related to the needs and resources.
So it would be information the Needs and Resources Committee could use in their subcommittee work?
I think
Okay.
it should be used, yes.
Okay.
Shavonna needs one, but that's okay. We were just gonna share.
Okay, first, I'd like everybody to look at the property taxes by county per capita, so property taxes. And you can see, so this would be, I guess, resources. And the populated part of the state, for instance, Douglas, Sarpy counties, Lancaster County, Buffalo Hall, Lincoln, so Adams, where all the populated areas are, pay the least amount of property taxes per capita. They're all white, so in the very lowest category in property taxes. Next, I would go to income taxes by county, so that's the blue map. The income is generally in the populated areas, Douglas, Washington, Cass, Lancaster, Buffalo County's Kearney, even Lincoln, North Platte, Hall, and Adams, Grand Island, Hastings, all have high income, pay more income tax with the higher income. And then the sales tax is the reddish-orange map. I think this is pretty irrelevant because, of course, the populated areas will pay more sales tax per capita because the trade area, everybody from the whole trade area shops in Omaha or Lincoln, Hastings, Grand Island, whatever. So they do pay per capita more sales tax, but I think you could take this map out, actually. It doesn't mean too much there. But then probably the biggest thing is the big three taxes by county per capita. And again, you can see Sarpy, Lancaster, Hall, Lincoln, North Platte, Grand Island, Lincoln, Omaha. County level of big three taxes per capita, even though that's where the income is, actually pays less taxes than quite a bit under less taxes per average of the state. Douglas is average, at least by color. So just an indication that the rural areas of the state pay a high number of taxes compared to the urban areas of the state. So I think that is a very good indication of needs and resources, and just another reason to show that our TIOSA formula, well, you can either say it's broken or needs a large amount of adjustment. So just wanted to pass that out and show the I realize it's more of a macro thing than we're looking at more micro things right now in TIOSA, but just a macro view of how the TIOSA formula works. Thank you. And I'll sure take any questions or.
Dr. Standish?
Senator Merman, I was curious if your per capita accounted for demographics like our children in the count. Was this birth to all ages?
Well, this was done by the Legislative Research and used census data. So it's, I think, the total population, so that'd be adults and children. And I don't know if that varies, you know, between rural and urban as far as how big the families are, but probably not a lot of difference.
Senator Linehan.
Thank you. Senator Merman, I agree that the sales tax throws everything off. So could you have the legislative, whichever office that is, do one of these, do a map without, on total taxes without the sales tax? Because sales tax is not, but this is helpful. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I could do that. I thought of that too after the maps were done, but I don't think they had time to do it. But
Okay.
I'm sure I can by our next meeting.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I
Or
would
even
also-
before.
I would also be curious about the population breakdown to take the demographics into account, because this is just creating like averages, and averages can sometimes skew data sets quite a bit. So I would be curious about what population we're taking into account when we're looking at this. Because if you had a higher population of children, that would definitely take your per capita down. So I'd want to find a way to stabilize for that.
I think this seems like a good topic for the Needs and Resources Committee to bring to its next meeting to dig into, some good questions to dive into. And I know Dr. Foster's not here, but Dr. Plaus, if you could make sure that Senator Merman has the dates for your upcoming meetings, that would be great, and you can continue this conversation. Thank you, Senator Merman.
Okay, thank you. Just one question about the student population per county. Is that's what you're asking for, is a
No, I'm
student?
just curious of the age range, and we can look at this in the committee, it's not a problem. I'm just
Okay.
thinking out loud and asking questions. I think it would be great for the committee to look at the age range of population when we consider people as taxpayers throughout the state, and whether that changes the picture, I genuinely don't know. It's just a question that I have.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you both. Before we move on to our next subcommittee, are there any final questions or thoughts on our first subcommittee? Dr. Plaus doesn't want to go back out there, I see, so we are going to move on to, no. We are going to move on to the second subcommittee, which is the spending subcommittee report, and I'll be presenting on behalf of our committee, and so just take me a minute to get set up. And while I get set up, there's some documents that are going to get passed out. There is a presentation that's on the table there. If you could give me a hand with that, Dr. Four. And then we're going to pass around the raw documents that our committee used during the process. So we will make reference to these during the presentation. And it also provides all of the raw information that we used as we did our committee's work.
Thanks, sir. You know what I mean? Yeah. You don't think, yeah.
Okay, our second subcommittee focused specifically on school spending. Okay, sorry about that. Our second subcommittee focused on spending and specifically how that spending relates to various cost growth indexes. Our committee met on several occasions over the past quarter. About half of those meetings were virtually and about half of those meetings were in person. We met as far away as Arlington for some of us and as close as right here in Lincoln. And I did not tally the total number of hours we put into it, but for all the committee members that were involved, they contributed a lot of time and a lot of analysis, and appreciate everyone's work doing that. Some of the research questions that we began with, in fact, the process for us started with a discussion around there's an infinite number of things that we can focus on, but our first meeting really tried to drill down to what are the questions that we need to be able to answer in order to know where to direct our time and energies when it comes to researching this information. And ultimately, we began with a subset of 5 questions, and then those questions continued to become more refined, and we added to them as we went through the process. And right now, our questions listed up there on the screen. What's the total share expenditure for instruction? That was one that we dug into. How has school spending in Nebraska changed over time? How does school spending over time compare to various selected inflationary indexes? We'll explain which ones we selected and why here shortly. How does per pupil costs vary across Nebraska's school districts, and how might we compare to other states? What is the total share of spending for school salaries and benefits? What is a student-to-teacher ratio in Nebraska, and how does it compare to other states? And then finally, what is the status of the new school revenue caps? A special thank you to Tyler Kelly, Bryce Wilson. We threw a lot of questions your guys' way. And all of the information that you see in these packets, those 2 gentlemen helped us to pull together, helped us to present and ultimately be able to analyze as a group. We also included the "and" team there because we know there's probably other folks that you work with and we wouldn't want them to feel left out. So thank you very much. And welcome, Tyler, to your new role at NDE. It's been great getting to know you through this process. So what we're going to do from a structure standpoint is we're going to answer each of those questions, and it's going to be an iterative sort of reference. So part of it's going to be on the screen, and then for some of the questions, we're going to make reference to some of the raw documents that you see in this handout. This document has been colored with various Post-it notes in order to make it quick to be able to reference those items. So kind of have both handy as we go. But our first question we dug into is, what is the share of total expenditure in Nebraska schools for instruction? And just for transparency purposes, we use the AFR for this. The information was provided by our team at NDE, and it came directly from the annual financial report, and it was the 2500s that were used. So that's the all general fund expenditures category. So it's the biggest of the numbers in the general fund AFR. Most of the data that we're looking at is for 10-year data sets. And in this case, the answer to the question is articulated in those bar charts. And what you're going to see is the very specific answer to that question is about 2/3 of the spending in Nebraska schools goes towards instruction. Specifically, beyond that, the other takeaway from this chart that we discussed as a committee is that while most of the categories stayed relatively stable during the 10 years that you see pictured in the chart, there is an aberration for the 4 years that would have been the years that school districts received federal ESSER funding during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the additional receipts that came through the ESSER funding, that also led to a greater number of receipts that were categorized as federal expenses because of those, which of course had a bit of a skew on all of the other data points as it took up a greater proportion of spending during that period of time. Question 2 then is, how has school spending changed over time? And we're going to answer that a number of different ways in some of the subsequent slides. But as we answered those questions, part of our task that was given to us at the last meeting together as a full commission is how does that spending compare to various cost growth or inflationary indexes? There were several that we looked at as a committee, and ultimately we decided none of them fit perfectly what we do in schools. So we felt it was best to identify the three that would kind of give a 360-degree view of sorts as to where our schools were at from a spending standpoint. So in the lower right-hand corner there, what you're going to find is a description of CPIU Midwest, which was one of the three items that we selected. Think of that as kind of the traditional view of how inflation is measured. It's a market basket of goods that's monitored over time to see how those costs change. It's a good index because CPI is a familiar idea to people. It has its limitations, though, in that schools don't spend money on a market basket of goods. We spend money predominantly on instruction and people. So it's not a perfect fit, but it's certainly a lens that's familiar to folks, and we felt for that reason it was good to include. On the left-hand side, you also see the Employment Cost Index, wages and salaries, private industry workers, ECWAG is the acronym. That is a index that captures what is the cost to employ workers and how is that changing over time within the economy. It includes both the public and the private sector, and it tracks to try and see how wages change over time. That's a lens that's more aligned with where schools spend their dollars. As you're going to see in a later question, a high percentage of our spending in schools is on people. It does have some limitations, though, in that it does combine a lot of different subsets of employment, public, private, and at any one given period of time, there can be subsets of that employment that have different factors that influence. But nonetheless, we thought it was a valuable lens since it does tend to capture the cost to employ. And then the last one in the upper right-hand corner is the state and local consumption expenditures, and that focuses on what the cost is to operate government. So if CPI is the cost to live, and ECWAG is the cost to employ, SLICE is the cost to operate government. And that includes cost changes as it pertains to state, local government, political subdivisions like schools, city, counties, and that tracks spending in those categories as well. So all three as a collective provide a nice index to think about school spending in Nebraska, but none in and of itself is a perfect fit with how schools operate. But we ultimately felt it was best to provide a really diverse perspective and that those three gave us a nice view of the dollars that you're going to see here shortly. Okay, there's a number of screens. This first one I'm going to go through relatively quickly because the next one is more informative. But this is your raw data screen. So what you see on the table are the years. It's a 10-year band of time. You see what the 2,500 expenditures were, what the change was, and then ultimately what the percent change was for schools. And then what you see is the index for CPI, then ECWAG, and then SLICE, and then what that percent change is as well. In the boxes at the next level down, what you see is what's the 1-year, 5-year, 7-year, and 10-year average, and how those indexes or school spending changed during that band of time. So you're able to compare the raw data to see ultimately what that looks like in those different indices. Ultimately, what we did, and this is the even more informative slide, is in order to make it really easy to understand, we took the raw data, and by we I mean NDE took the raw data, and they included what the nominal amounts were for school spending. So in the left-hand column, it should match the data on the prior slide, and then they inflation adjusted it to those three different indexes. So what would the school spending have been and what would the change have been had it been on that indice? And to make it really clear and easy to understand, that 1, 5, 7, and 10-year average that you see under schools, that same number was produced, that's nominal, and it was turned into an inflation-adjusted budget growth number. So what you see there, for example, under CPI Midwest, is the inflation-adjusted spending growth in schools last year. So the one-year average was 0.11, so about 0.1%. If you look at the 5-year, it was 0.62, 7-year 0.68, and 10-year 1.28. If you move over to the right to the ECWAG data point, school spending would have been less than the ECWAG growth last year, so that's a negative 0.66. And then for the 5, 7, and 10, you can see that it was a 0.67, 0.28, 0.56. And then SLICE, which again measures the cost to run government, which that's what that index is measuring. The one-year spending growth, when it's adjusted to the SLICE scale, is a negative 2% for 1 year. 5-year, it's negative 0.1 or 0.87. For 7-year, it's negative 1.43, and the 10-year is negative 0.93. So you can see through those 3 different indices, schools are slightly above or slightly below an inflation-adjusted spending growth amount. Moving on to question 3. And before we dive into what you see on the chart, if you could all just take a look at this real quick, because there's some raw information that would be good to digest before we dig in. And so there is a teal colored Post-it. If you want to turn to the section that has the teal colored Post-it, this particular question is asking, how does per pupil cost vary across Nebraska school districts? And what you're going to find on the next several pages is school spending from lowest cost ADM to highest. If you flip a few pages till you get to the pink Post-it note, it's the same data is presented smallest school to largest school. And then in the brown colored Post-it note, it is organized by county. So there are several different ways in which the data has been presented in order to make it informative for all of you, and it's all the different ways that we looked at the data as a committee. Ultimately, the question itself is, how does per pupil cost vary across Nebraska school districts? And ultimately, we did a size comparison for this particular one, and what you see on the screen right now is a simple regression analysis. So a regression analysis to describe what you're looking at. On the left-hand side, you see the cost per ADM. Running along the x-axis is school size. The line of best fit, and a line of best fit is intended to illustrate what the relationship is between 2 factors. The line is intended to communicate what that relationship is between 2 factors. In this case, the 2 factors are spending and district enrollment growth. The size of the circle is intended to indicate the size of the district, and then of course the dot itself is the district. And what you see is this particular regression analysis produced a finding where the R-squared was a 0.53. And so essentially what that means, to simplify, is that about 53% of the variance that exists between school size and per pupil spend is accounted for in the size of the school. So that means 0.47, or if it's easier for all of you, I can just say it's 50-50. About 50% of the variance in the cost to educate a pupil is the size of the district, and then the other 50% is something else other than the size of the district. Some of you may not know what an R-squared of 0.53 means, so I'm going to try and provide a very textbook analysis of what that is. It would be considered a low moderate to moderate R value for a regression analysis. So there is a relationship, but it's a moderate relationship. Okay? We continued on with our conversation about per pupil spending And one of the questions that our committee had asked was, well, how does that vary from Nebraska in comparison to other school districts? And so we identified different groupings of states to compare ourselves to at different points in time in our dialogue. At the point in time we produced this question and this question's data, we were trying to look at other Midwestern states. And one of the first things that we noticed is that there's a lot of variance that exists up there, which we asked a lot of questions about that. And I think the answers to those questions are really informative for the members of the commission and anyone who's reviewing the data that we have. And so in order to capture some of this analysis, there's several documents I'm going to have you make reference to here again. So the first one is on the very front page, and it comes from the Census Bureau. And one of the things that this data set does is it takes the data from states, and then once it gets the data from states, it treats it all the same. But I think a key finding that we found is that the way that states collect and code data varies from one state to the next. And to illustrate that, turn to the pages that begin with the little yellow tab at the very, very top of the document. The very, very top. So it's one of the first few pages you see once you enter the document. And what you're going to see is a document that's posted on the Nebraska Department of Education website. And this is essentially the formula that our state uses to calculate per pupil spending. And so what you can see is that Nebraska includes some items in the calculation and not others. It also includes some very unique items. For example, when you think about the value of the facility and contents that kids are educated in, 3% of that value is included in the calculation of the per pupil spending average for that district, and then of course it's a part of the statewide. If you turn the page, you're going to see the formula that the state of Iowa uses to calculate per pupil spending. One of the interesting things we noted about the Iowa per pupil spend is that in their own document where they explain how they calculate per pupil spending in their state, they're encouraging people not even to compare districts within their state because of the various methods with which districts can choose to code spending, and because some spending counts for per pupil calculations and other doesn't, it's just best to evaluate with a bit of caution. And that's that second paragraph in the first page of the Iowa document. If you flip a few more pages, you're going to see how Kansas calculates their per pupil spending in their state. If you keep flipping, you're going to find Missouri's calculation method for how they calculate per pupil spending. And what you're going to see is that there's items that are included in their calculation and items that are excluded in their calculation. And if you keep flipping in the document, you're going to see South Dakota as our neighbor to the north and what they use to calculate their per pupil spending. Ultimately, what we found is that there is great variance that exists from one state to the next in terms of what is counted for spending when it comes to calculating per pupil spending, how FTE are calculated. So by FTE, we mean the number of kids. So the number of students is a necessary mathematical component to calculate a per pupil spending average. And the data is counted in different ways and at different points in time in the year. And then ultimately, each of the states, just like any organization, there are discretionary decisions that are made how to code different expenditures. And that can vary across states and sometimes even within the same organization or the same district, and not for nefarious reasons. It's just a matter of somebody's got to make a decision as to whether something's a supply or it's something else. So ultimately, really what we found, and you see it highlighted with that green box, is those averages that you see from one state to the next. It is not an apples to apples comparison. In fact, we found that it's very much apples to oranges. We'll make a more clear recommendation later, but the data isn't comparable in order to draw those comparisons as we wished we could have in our committee's work. Yes, Dr. Turman.
Before you go on, maybe to drill down on that just a little bit, I think one of the things I commented when they brought this slide to us was that having been from South Dakota, having been on a school board there, I know that that number is not an accurate reflection of the per student spending. You want to maybe give the rest of the commission a little bit of the homework that you did in reaching out to South Dakota and trying to do some comparisons against at least what you know with your district? I think it's helpful context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't remember if this was our third or fourth. I think it was our second meeting where we were looking at this data, and Dr. Turman had shared from his past board experience that, you know, living in Nebraska now and serving in the role that he's in, and then having been a former school board member, it didn't make sense on a chart like this to see the variance that existed between Nebraska and South Dakota based on what he knew. NDE provided, because one of the questions, I believe it was you, Senator Breezy, who had asked, how are these calculated? That's how we came to dig into these different calculation methods from different states, which is a really informative answer to the question to find that they're not really comparable at all. But I was curious. So once I saw the South Dakota information, I reached out to their State Department of Education, and I asked them what they were including in their calculation. And generally, what they shared led me to believe that it was some number between the bookends of our 2200s and our 2400s. So 2200s are our adjusted general fund expense, and the 2400s, I believe, is our total expense minus federal funds. Is that accurate to our NDE finance folks over there? And one of the districts I chose to compare ourselves to, because it's an indexed district that we often look at in our school district, is Sioux Falls, which is one that Dr. Stavum knows well. She was most recently superintendent there. Sioux Falls is a great school district, so nothing about what I'm sharing here is intended to be a judgmental thought in any way, shape, or form. But when you use the 2200s and the 2400s, which is essentially the bookend range of what South Dakota is using to calculate their per pupil spend, and you take a district like the district I'm in that I know best, which is about 23,000 kids, and Sioux Falls, which is about 24,000 students, and if we were to use a similar calculation method in Nebraska as South Dakota, the per pupil spend is a smidge lower in Millard through the 2200s and the 2400s. That's not to suggest we're more efficient or better. It's just to suggest that when you make things more apples to apples, not that that's a precise calculation, it does have a pretty dramatic impact on what those comparisons look like. So again, stealing some thunder from later in the presentation, it's not to judge that anybody up there is better or worse, or that you should take the comparison that I did out of curiosity between my district and a very similar one in a state to the north of us and draw any conclusions, other than we probably shouldn't be looking at those numbers and assuming somebody's spending a lot less or spending a lot more, or they're any more or less efficient based upon the data that's shared across state lines, because it's not apples to apples data. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So I understand all this. Is there not a way that we could figure out in Iowa, Kansas, surrounding states, how much they spend total, and then divide it by the number of children in the public schools?
That is not something our committee did, Senator Lenahan.
But wouldn't that be more accurate? If we can't trust the Census Bureau numbers, which I get, then we know about what we spend and we know how many kids are in the schools, so it's a division, simple division. And couldn't you do that for each state? Surrounding us at least?
So again, going back to the individual state calculations, there are things that they are counting and things that they're not counting. They're also collecting their FTE counts at different points in time. So your numerator and denominators aren't necessarily going to be similar comparisons.
But they know, like, I would assume that the governor of Iowa, the governor of South Dakota, knows how much they spend statewide on public education, and they have a pretty good handle on the approximate number of children in public schools.
Perhaps. I can't speak for them. And that's not information that we dug into as a committee, so I would venture not to want to speculate.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Ultimately, this document right here on top, which was produced by NDE, that's a screenshot of it. The part that we highlighted there is just be cautious when you make the comparison. Okay, next question is, what is the share of total spending for salaries and benefits in Nebraska schools? And what you see in the chart there is in green. Well, first of all, you see 10 years worth of data. And then what you see for each of those years in green is the dollars that are spent on salaries. In blue are the dollars that are spent on benefits, health insurance, vision insurance, state retirement, other benefit items that a district may have. And then in the gold or bronze color are other object codes. Think operational costs. One thing that we did note is that districts that contract services, some of those contracted services that include a salary, are going to show up over in that gold color. So for example, one of the examples that Jason and Pender brought up is that if you're contracting for a school psychologist with your ESU, that's not a direct salary cost for you. It's going to show up as an other. If you contract out your transportation services or custodial services, that's going to show up in a gold category. And of course, those are employee-heavy costs. So you see the years that are there generally fluctuates between 78 and 80%. And if you assume that some provision of that gold category includes costs that would have otherwise been personnel costs, but they're paid as a contract, the 80+% of spending in schools goes directly towards people. Our next question deals with student to teacher ratios in Nebraska. And in your document that has the Post-its on it, there is a green colored document. So it doesn't have a Post-it note on it, but it is a green colored document like this one right here. One of the things that we looked at is how has the student to teacher ratio in Nebraska changed over time. Very, very little change, I think, is what you will see in the chart that's illustrated here. But the subsequent follow-up question was, you know, how does that compare from one state to the next? And for this question, just to provide a bit of reprieve to our friends at NDE, instead of having you look at 10 or 12 states, we asked you to just look at 5 states or 4 other states other than Nebraska. And again, the data here shows that it's very similar, but ultimately what we found as we were digging into this is, again, it's just really hard to compare data across states. I'll give you a really great example. If you look at this green sheet right here that I had directed you towards, and you find the state of Nebraska, what you're going to see is it's looking at 1,098 schools, or I'm sorry, yes, 1,098 schools and 279 operating districts. We have 244, last year 245 districts in Nebraska, and we have fewer than that many public schools in Nebraska. So when you think about how that across state data is collected, it's just a really good analytical process to understand how it's collected. And again, this is a screenshot from the NDE document that they provided. The way the data is collected at the national level is people looking at websites, calling administrative assistants in schools, and ultimately it's a fairly informal method of collecting data in order to make these comparisons from one state to the next. So again, while we would like to be able to compare this information across states, it's probably good to know that when we're looking at these websites comparing states, the data that's being collected is not necessarily collected in a consistent manner. So hard to compare. The final item that we dug into, question 7, is your very last document with the pink Post-it note, and it deals with the revenue caps. And there were essentially 5 questions, I believe, that were researched under the revenue cap by NDE. It was overriding the base revenue cap, the requesting of override dollars, the base PTA and how that changes over time, how districts are accessing the authority they have, and ultimately what the property tax growth is. You are welcome to study that document. What you see on the screen is the concluding paragraph from the document that kind of wraps it all together. And essentially what our findings were when it came to the revenue cap is that the revenue collected is generally in line with that base revenue cap plus growth factors and/or inflation, the measures that we looked at previously. However, there is a growth in the untaxed but authorized property tax authority that has accumulated during that band of time. And so districts are taxing below their authority, but the untaxed authority continues to grow. So there's a gap between those two that exists. During the 3 years, 3.38% was the average for property tax request. Essentially, when we boil down what did we find when the rubber meets the road, Nebraska school spending is generally in line with those inflationary measures we looked at, a little bit higher than some, a little bit lower than others, but generally in the range. There's a wide variance in per pupil spending across Nebraska. School size is one factor that accounts for some of the variance. Again, the R squared is 0.53, so about half of the variance is because of school size. Per pupil spending has grown generally consistent with inflationary measures. School spending across states should not be compared since data are not gathered and reported consistently across states. Personnel, salary, and benefits account for greater than 80% of school spending. Approximately 2/3 of school spending is on instruction. And data provided on student to pupil, boy, I gotta watch my words there, getting tongue-tied. Ratios were collected and reported inconsistently, therefore it's difficult to compare. And most schools are collecting revenue within the limits of the base cap and are generally in line with comparative inflationary measures. However, accumulated unused authority may have exceeded the original intent of the legislation. In terms of next steps for our committee, things that we've discussed school spending efficiency recommendations. That'll be some of our next step. In fact, we already started some of that conversation. We were digging into special education and didn't feel like we were at the point where we were ready to report anything yet. And then the second was discuss any potential recommendations to the revenue cap or other school caps and lids related to school finance based on our findings. Questions?
I have some. Are you running the meeting too? Or
I'm multitasking here, Senator Linehan.
Okay, so may I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
So on the number of students per teachers, because this is a subject that's driven me to frustration several times, because the legislature, hears about teachers having 21, 22, 23 students, which goes with what I see in my grandkids' classrooms. But then if you take the number of teachers we have, supposedly around 24,000, and I don't know, what's their student population, 315,000?
325 or so, give or take
325.
10,000.
So that comes up to about 13 students per teacher. So why are there 21 kids in a classroom or 22 if it says we have enough teachers that there should be 13 kids in a classroom?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. In fact, it gives me an opportunity to reference one of the documents that I failed to mention in my prior comments. If you find the yellow Post-it note, this is another document that is posted on the State Department of Education. And what it breaks down is a considerable amount of information about Nebraska schools and Nebraska school staff. And Senator, probably the easiest answer to your question is What you had referenced is the teacher in the classroom with kids. There are other people who are certified teachers, but they're not serving in that classroom with kids. So a special education teacher might be an example of a teacher that's in a building that's not with 20 kids in a class, in a kindergarten class. They might be with several different classes.
So how many of them?
I'll continue to
Okay.
answer here. There's
Okay.
interventionists, there's school counselors. So there's a lot of different certified educator roles that serve in different capacities that cause that ratio to be lower than maybe what the average kindergarten class size is, for example.
So a third of the certified personnel is not in the classroom?
I don't think that proportion would be an accurate proportion, but part of this document is if you wanted to take a look in here, find page 72 of that document.
I can't read this, so, I mean, I could read it if my eyes were better, but I can't.
Mr. Dolliver, you want to find it on yours? And
Yep, I'm working on it.
yes, with the benefit of hindsight, Senator Linehan, we would have not made this really small font size.
Well, you can just tell me.
I'll
Yeah.
give an example based on a teacher. So my classroom, I'm gonna see students 8 periods a day, and my class I'm missing right now is 20. But then I earlier today had a class of 8 in a college credit macroeconomics course. So that would skew my numbers over time in a high school class, especially if you're looking at an elective high school course.
And if you were curious of how many FTE are in different categories, you're going to see a listing of that by category on page 72, page 71 and 72. It breaks down all the different categories in that document, which one of the things that we learned when we dug into it, not everybody classifies the same way. For example, what a coordinator does in Lincoln Public Schools is a different role than what a coordinator does in Millard, for example. So, but nonetheless, it
But
shows
there
you the
was-
different categories of employees that serve, that are certified educators in Nebraska schools on page 71 and 72.
So should we call them teachers?
So we would refer to them as teachers, but in terms of how you are classifying the question as if our class sizes are 20 kids for every one kindergarten teacher, if we're using kindergarten as an example. If you wanted to know what the kindergarten class size average is across the state, that is a different question than what is the teacher, certified educator per pupil ratio in the state of Nebraska. When you're capturing the per pupil to teacher ratio in Nebraska, it is categorizing taking all of the different people who are teachers but serve in different capacities into account when they do that calculation. So in an elementary school, it's probably a librarian, it's a counselor perhaps, it's a nurse maybe, it's a special education teacher or 2 or 3, there may be a literacy interventionist, there may be a math interventionist. Those are all going to be certified teachers, but they're working potentially with different subsets of kids. And that looks a little bit different. We were talking earlier about the impacts of poverty. A Title I school that has a higher proportion of the students in that setting in poverty may have more ancillary staff serving in an intervention capacity. There may be an additional counselor or additional interventionists that are certified teachers, but maybe they specialize in intervening with students that are struggling to read or struggling to do math or receiving other services. And so those distributions may vary for different reasons, but the per pupil, the staff to pupil calculation is going to include all of the certified adults that serve in that school working with kids, or in this case, across the state, or maybe even more specifically, when you're even looking at Nebraska with the statewide data, it's capturing more districts and schools than what we have in public schools. So either the data's not right, or they also screened and collected data from non-public schools. I don't know.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I have more questions, but I'll give other people a chance.
Thank you.
Along those lines too, so as I look at that list that's on 71, 72, what's an instructional support paraprofessional, and how's that different from the paraeducators that is a SPED paraprofessional, which is like 5,100 FTE? Those two categories alone have almost 7,000 FTE in them.
Yep, so a special education para is going to be a para educator that is coded to work with a student who has an IEP. They're separated out in a collection like this from an instructional para because it may be, first of all, that para would have to be working specifically with a child with an IEP. And it's also categorized different from a bookkeeping standpoint with special education funding at the federal and state level.
So within the teacher category, which is obviously the largest, the 20,000 that they've got listed, you would have a dedicated special education teacher in that as well.
And I don't have the document open right now, unless special education teachers on there are broken out separately, which I can't recall off the top of my head whether they are, they would be included in that as well.
They've got some breakouts, but some, but not many. But yeah, something more for us to explore.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Merman?
The instruction part of the expenditures, I assume that includes extracurriculars and sports costs?
You're talking right here? That probably
Yes.
depends. So some extracurricular costs in districts may be paid for with other receipts, like gate receipts from games or a booster club. But what probably is going to be included in there is the cost to pay the coach, anything that's paid for out of the general fund to support the activity, which when you get to different activities, different proportions of the cost are paid for with general fund dollars. And that isn't even probably going to be the same from one district to the next. Dr. Plaus, Mr. Dolliver, as other superintendents, anything to share on that? Okay.
Do we have any idea what percentage, average, I guess you said there's a lot of variability on
There's
how that's determined?
it'd be hard to tease that out, Senator Merman.
Okay, thank you.
I think generally, when it comes to activities, your general fund costs are transportation and the coaches' stipends. Those are generally the two things that are in most, but not all.
Thanks, Dr. Plaus. Other questions? Senator Linehan?
On question 1, the slide, multicolored slide,
This one right here, Senator Linehan?
yes.
Okay.
What's other?
You know what? I don't know that I can tell you off the top of my head, but I bet our friends at NDE, Mr. Kelly, is that something that you'd feel comfortable answering?
That's okay.
My guess, I'm going to just guess, and then Tyler can clean this up. If green is administration, if the navy color is federal programs, if instruction is yellow, and operations is what color would you call that? Crimson, maroon?
Maroon.
It would essentially be all other costs that a district is bearing. And I'm assuming the state programs might be some of our state grant programs where funding flows through. Any luck there, Tyler?
I have another question. On the, the chart that's how has school spending changed over time?
Is it a slide, Senator
Yes,
Linehan?
I'm sorry, slide.
This one? This one?
This is an inside joke,
Keep
but the
going.
pages
There
aren't
you go,
numbered.
that one right there.
Okay.
He'll explain later.
Okay.
Yes, so if I'm reading this top chart right, so nominal general fund, the blue, that's what we actually spent on public education.
So that is the 2500s in the AFR, which is the largest of the numbers in the AFR for general fund spending.
Okay, so it's not always spent, it's just those that are coded that way.
The 2500s are everything in the general fund. So you would, if you looked at the 20,000s or 20,200s or 20,400s, they're going to exclude different things like, and I'll do my best off the top of my head, I think 2400s exclude federal spending. 2200s, I think it excludes pre-K and maybe some specialty programs related to poverty maybe. So there's different things that are adjusted that are pulled out. But the reason, Senator Linehan, we use the 2500s is so that it included all general fund spending for that year.
So then we go over and compare it to CPI. What is this number, what's the 3,905,000,000? What number is that? What does that represent?
So this was a chart that was created by our friends at NDE, so we would need them to answer that for us. Essentially what I think they were trying to do is figure out how to recalc so that we could figure out what an inflation adjusted number was. So my guess is this is a spreadsheet that has a formula running on the back end in order to recalc the inflation adjusted number. Is that an accurate statement, guys? Yes.
So is it saying that if spending only increased by CPI, it wouldn't be 5 billion, but it'd be more like 4 billion?
It's just giving you a baseline number, and then what it's doing is growing that number by what CPI was that year, so you can see what the year-over-year change was, and then ultimately you can figure out what the 1, 5, 7, and 10-year average is. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, you guys did the data. Is that correct? Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Here's my question. My question is, if we had just used CPI, if school spending only increased by CPI, would we be at 3.9 billion versus 5.1 billion?
I would say yes.
Okay. So we keep going across the chart. If we use ECI, it'd be at 3.6. Something doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, I see your question, Senator Linehan. The numbers aren't jiving when you look at what the change are. I think it's because we're shifting back and forth between negative and positive numbers.
Well, I think that
Tyler, Bryce?
seems to me that the question is, if we were spending 3.4 in 14-15, and then you use CPI, ECI, or SLICE, what would we be spending today? That's what we need to know, right?
I'm wondering as I look at that, because if you look at SLICE, if we started at 3.5 billion in 2014, probably wouldn't be spending less by 24, 25. So I'm having trouble following that. I don't know that that's, I don't think that's doing what we think it's doing.
I don't know how to articulate it though, but, this is saying that, okay, so you see the general fund, how we did grow, and then it said, basically what this saying is that we grew about like, what's the closest? Probably the schools grew about just like CPI, because we were within, like the 1 year was 0.11. Like how do you say? Schools grew 1.2 over 10 years. Let's do that. Over 10 years, the schools in Nebraska grew at 1.28% more than the Midwest CPI over those same 10 years. But schools grew, if you look at the ECI WAG, whatever that one is, the schools grew 0.56% over the 10 years. But if you compare it to the SLICE, the schools went under what the SLICE index was.
So I don't think it's doing what you think it's doing,
It's not
Senator
saying
Linehan.
it's a cap or anything. It's just saying, basically, schools grew over 10 years, 1.28% over the Midwest CPI number, or you could say we grew 0.56 over the ECI WAG. It's kind of showing, I think the intent was that schools were just a little bit over regular CPI, just to compare with inflation. Where does the schools land?
And this slide right here is maybe more informative to your question, is when you use the scale of the index, that's what the number is listed there, and that's what the year-over-year change is, which is part of the reason why we wanted to provide multiple lenses, because we knew this would be a natural area of curiosity. So when you see it captured on the same indice for itself, you can see what's happening. So like, for example, with SLICE, if you begin with 100, you end up with 163. When you begin with 100 on CPI U Midwest, you end up at 140, and ECWAG, or I'm sorry, ECWAG 140 and CPIU Midwest 131.10. So this maybe normalizes it a little bit differently. In every case, the numbers are growing and by what percent they're growing. And that gives you the raw data. And what I think Tyler was intending to do with the other slide is to show from a percent standpoint what the inflation adjusted percent change is. And perhaps in the spirit of transparency and showing our work, we created confusion. Is that an accurate?
Yes, I believe that's, and again, I'm sorry, I haven't looked at this in about a month.
I think this chart is misleading.
Yeah.
I do believe this is question 2 has given that growth relative to the CPI.
But the numbers don't add up, guys, because if you look at CPI over those 10 years, inflation, except for those, there's 2 years, school spending was running well ahead of CPI. I mean, it's right there, it's on that same chart, unless these numbers aren't, that isn't what these numbers are.
So if you're looking at this chart right here, Senator Linehan,
I'm not looking at that chart, I'm looking at the next chart.
which I going back to what my assumption is that those dollar amounts aren't doing what the premise of the question thinks they're doing, which then if we look over here, which gets at what the actual index is doing separate from that, you can just look at what the year-over-year changes were and what the growth was, and I think that's giving you your 1, 5, 7, and 10.
Okay, well, I'll study this. On these indexes, on the employment cost index, what percentage of that index is government spending, public spending?
That was not information that we teased out. There are a lot of different private and public, but at no point did we encounter data that told us what proportion of the index was public versus private.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it'd be easy to update that other one. Would you agree, Bryce and Tyler? Yeah. Yep. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the property tax authority analysis document, in the conclusions, on the last page. Well, first of all, I'm assuming this is general fund property tax receipts only?
It would probably be general fund and special building fund, anything that is in the revenue cap, correct?
Okay. And then just a comment more than anything, on the conclusion page, it says that the total property tax request has risen by 3.8% annually, but it notes that that is not accounting for property tax credits, and that if actual property tax receipts to schools declined, if the credits were accounted for, actual property tax receipts to schools declined. I just want to, just clarifying that language. The property tax credits are property tax receipts to schools. They're just not paid for by property tax owners.
Correct. I read that to assume so people didn't think the cost to the homeowner directly was that amount, trying to give credence to phase 1 of the committee's work, which was to highlight the fact that nearly $600 million less in property taxes was paid by property taxpayers because of the front-loaded tax credit or the previous income tax credits. So I think it was an intent to be transparent.
And I get that. I just think that we need to be cognizant of the school spend component is what the school levied, right? So the state has picked up a portion of that, but the school spend component is the total dollar amount.
Correct. That's at 3.38. Yep. Yep. Other questions? Am I safe to resume my duties as chair on the other side of the table? Okay, our next agenda item is going to be Mr. Wilson providing an update on the last legislative session.
All right. Really, there's only one bill that I was going to talk about today, and that's LB 803 that is going to have significant impacts on the really the budgeting process for school districts. LB 803, I think the most important piece, at least as I talk to superintendents about it, is understanding it goes into effect for the 27-28 school year, not this upcoming school year. So what it will do when it goes into effect next budget cycle, so a year from now, essentially it requires school districts to notify the county assessor on or before June 1st of every county in which the political subdivision has the authority to levy a tax and the date of their first budget hearing. So they have to do that on or before June 1st. It changes the joint public hearing requirements. Currently, those are subject to whether they go over the 2% plus the real growth in their district to determine whether they participate in a joint public hearing, and that takes place between September 5th and September 20th, September 15th, I think, maybe actually. That now the change there next year will go into effect where all school districts are part of the joint public hearing that takes place on July 1 through July 14th. One representative from the school district and one from their voting governing body. So one school board member will attend that joint public hearing. At that joint public hearing, school districts obviously won't know what their assessed valuation is at that point, since that's not required to be certified until August 20th. So what they are required to present on, which all political subdivisions are required to present that are attending, their budget process, how the budget affects the property tax request, information on the prior year's budget and tax request, and any preliminary information affecting their current year's budget. So those are the things that are required to be covered per statute at that joint public hearing occurring between July 1 and July 14th. A couple other important pieces. They're really, I guess for this group, the other one I would really highlight here that I haven't already touched on is just that a significant difference is if the school board is increasing their tax request amount or the levy is increasing, it now requires a 2/3 majority vote of their school board to approve that budget. If it happens to be a 7-member board, it would be a 4/7 vote to approve that school district budget. So those are I think the real keys to LB 803. Any questions on that? Okay. Any other legislative questions on bills that I missed?
This was the only bill that passed that really had a direct impact on school finance, correct?
That's true.
Okay. Are there any questions for Bryce? Any other questions on any of the other agenda items that we discussed today?
Wouldn't a 2/3 majority be 5 out of 7?
Bryce, I think Senator Merman just had a question for you. Senator Merman, do you want to ask your question again, please?
Yeah, going back to that previous slide, wouldn't a 2/3 majority be 5 out of 7 in the school board?
So the statute says 2/3 majority vote unless it's a 7-member board. And when it's a 7-member board, then it says a 4/7 approval to get that budget passed. So if it's not a 7-member board, then it's 2/3 majority.
Yeah, that's not the way the slide read. Yeah, I'm sure you're right.
I could probably did that slide better. I'll work on that.
Okay, any other questions for Bryce so we can get him to come back to the table? Any other questions on any of the other agenda items? Our next meeting as a commission is going to be on August 4th at 1 p.m. And the task between now and then, I think each subcommittee shared what some of their next steps were going to be. And I certainly don't want to speak for Dr. Maher, but I suspect each committee should be prepared to provide another update on the progress that they've made with any recommendations for us to discuss as a full committee. We're now at the portion of the agenda where public comment is taken. No one has signed up for public comment, so there is no need for us to have that agenda item. Thank you all for those of you who attended in person or who tuned in online. The April 30th, 2026 School Finance Review Commission meeting is adjourned. Have a great day.
Okay, drive safe.